The ground war in the Gulf has begun. US President George Bush is on his way back to the White House from Camp David. Alistair Stewart has this from Dhahran.
What we're gathering from American sources is so far the 2nd Marine Division, a force of some 20,000 men with M60 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, have crossed into Iraq. The 18th Airborne Division has moved into Kuwait. Their main armament is the Apache helicopter, which is equipped with TOW anti-tank missiles and Hellfire missiles that can destroy pretty well anything in their way. We were told that when it begins, this war will be prosecuted more violently than any in history. And the opening move certainly seemed to confirm that. The number of Iraqi vehicles already reported destroyed runs well into the double figures, and Iraqi troops are said to be surrendering en masse. The Allies have made preparations to take 100,000 surrenders. It may become more than that.
Do we assume then that there was never any sign of Iraqi troops withdrawing?
No, the briefings that we were getting right up to the last moment were that there were no pre-strike surrenders, no moves at all to withdraw, that they dug in their revetments, in their camps, hundreds, still thousands of tanks dug in. The latest figures that we had from military sources were that the destruction of Iraqi tanks was still only in the area of 16, perhaps 17,000. There's a lot out there that has still got to be attacked. They weren't moving, they were waiting for the inevitable.
Is it your impression that there was a sudden surge across the border? Because we've heard there's been a gradual build-up and certain skirmishes on the way.
Yes, that's right. In fact, for several days now, there have been reconnaissances in force, interventions where small groups have tried a particular point in the line. I think the most significant turning point were those pictures that you saw earlier on, earlier this morning or late last night, when the berms were finally breached and the heavy gear started moving in. It's clearly accelerated. General Kelly at the Pentagon said, when it starts, no one will be in any doubt. No one is. It started.
President Bush is to make an address at 3 o'clock. ITN will bring you that live from the White House. We're back at 2:45. Join us then.
Hello, we're interrupting our normal programmes to bring you the latest details on the Gulf War. We will stay on the air as the story develops. As you have probably heard, the ground war has begun to oust Iraqi troops from Kuwait. The latest we have is that Allied troops have crossed the border into occupied Kuwait to start the ground war against Iraq. That is according to the official Saudi television. And the American administration in Washington has confirmed that the ground war has begun. The joint forces have intensified their ground attacks in the last few hours, it said, on the Iraqi positions on the Kuwaiti border. Now, President Bush, who has been at his presidential retreat in Camp David, has now returned to the White House in Washington. This report from the American network CNN.
All right, all of the president's top advisors are gathered here, standing about 50, 60 feet from where I am, none of them in a mood to talk at this point. They're going to let the president make this announcement, but the national security advisor, the vice president is here, the chief of staff, I can see the vice president, and Governor Sununu as well, walking out towards the helicopter. A number of these people have been clustered here at the White House through the early hours of the evening. Primarily in National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft's office, as the first reports obviously came into them of what was going on in the Persian Gulf. And he presumably relaying those reports to the president up at Camp David, which is about 60 miles from here, up in the Catoctin Mountains of Maryland. It's about a 20-minute helicopter flight. The president and Secretary of State Baker went up there Friday afternoon. As you can see, there's the president now. The president was not just relaxing up at Camp David. He spent a good bit of the time on the phone. In fact, in the hour prior to the noon deadline, he spoke with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev having called President Bush to suggest that there was perhaps a last-minute possibility of merging the U.S. and Soviets' plans for a withdrawal from Kuwait. Mr. Bush having told Mr. Gorbachev politely that that just was not going to happen, that the U.S. and its coalition partners were firm in their intention to carry out a ground war if, in fact, the Iraqis made no attempt to withdraw after the noon deadline. The assessment from here at the White House was that there was no action on the part of the Iraqis, and in fact, as spokesman Marlon Fitzwater put it, the Iraqis continued to carry out the destruction of Kuwait with the destruction, as they're calling it here, the scorched earth policy of destroying the oil facilities. Fitzwater also made the point of noting that Iraq's only response to the noon deadline was to fire a Scud missile at Israel. So the president, having given his generals clearer instructions even prior to the noon deadline, allowed things to move forward as they have this evening, and we'll hear from the president himself very shortly. David?
Just a reminder that the ground war has begun. It began at 1 o'clock in the morning, our time. That was 8 hours after the deadline set by President Bush passed for Iraqi troops to leave Kuwait. We're going over now to Alistair Stewart in Riyadh. Alistair, what is the latest from you?
John, I'm actually in Dhahran, but we've been talking to people in Riyadh and we've been talking to military people around here. And what we understand so far is that the 2nd Marine Division is involved in an incursion into Iraq. That's what we've been told. But the military people say nothing will be firmed up completely until after the president has spoken. The 18th Airborne is also reported to have entered Kuwait. Their main armament is Apache helicopters with TOW missiles, which are tank busters, and Hellfire missiles, which can destroy moving vehicles and troop emplacements. There are reports coming through of very heavy surrenders by frontline Iraqi troops. Remember, they are not the Republican Guard. They're the ones who are at the north of Kuwait and south of Iraq. These are regular frontline soldiers. The Allies have made arrangements to take 100,000 of them as prisoners of war. The word we're getting is that it could be more than that. And we worked out that the Pentagon was saying earlier on that they needed a 6-hour countdown to this initiative. And we reckon that General Schwarzkopf must have given the order only about 3 hours after President Bush made his statement and the deadline was passed.
I wonder how that order came through. It was reported here that, in fact, President Bush told General Schwarzkopf even before the deadline that it was entirely in his initiative as to when to start this action.
One of the things that the president has stressed, John, throughout is that he doesn't want to make the mistakes of Vietnam, where President Johnson was seen to be targeting individual sites in Vietnam for bombing raids. President Bush said, leave the diplomacy and politics to me, and I will leave the fighting to you. He has total trust in General Schwarzkopf and in the command structure via Dick Cheney and Colin Powell. And there was no doubt at all that when Powell came over here with Cheney about 10 days ago, that was the arrangement that was reached. It is quite possible that there was an understanding before now, but people at the Pentagon and military sources here confirmed that a final and importantly legal document was signed, passing the order down through the Secretary of Defense to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, and on to Schwarzkopf in the field. He was given the green light. It was then his war. And as one of his officers said, when it begins, it will be prosecuted more violently than any war in history. No one will be in any doubt when it started, and they're not. It has.
Alistair, it's interesting that both times there have been deadlines, the January the 15th deadline to start the war, and now this one. There has been absolutely no hesitation on the part of the White House. They literally haven't waited even so much as a few hours.
Now, I think that's an important point, John, because the word that was coming back to Schwarzkopf, and he would have passed it on up to his political bosses, was that the commanders at a local level, the lieutenant colonels, the majors, people in charge of platoons and companies, the smaller groups, were saying, we can't keep these people penned up for too long. And you'll remember that Paul Davis had his interview with the commanding officer, Brigadier Cordingley, of the 4th Division, who said the politicians can't keep us waiting too long. And there has been a mood reported from the men in the trench that they've trained up. One officer was reported earlier today as saying, you get to a point where you've trained too much. You lose the edge, you lose the initiative, the adrenaline doesn't pump anymore. And I think that may have been a clincher for General Schwarzkopf. There have been a number of people, particularly from the Air Force side, who've been saying, we've done very well indeed in destroying Iraq's army. Only today they reported 1,687, I think it was, 85 tanks destroyed. They reckon that each sortie that was going up with these fighter bombers was taking out 1, 2, 3 tanks. Give us more time, they said, we'll make it easier. What Schwarzkopf had to do was balance that kind of pressure from his Air Force people against what his army was saying, and his army commanders were clearly saying the men are at fever pitch and are ready to go, and now is the time to launch it. One other point I should add is that there are tens of thousands of Marines on board ships like the Nassau, like the Iwo Jima, sitting out there in the Northern Gulf. Mike Nicholson was reporting on that on our late bulletin last night, saying that they are ready to go. You can't keep people penned up like that for too long, and we expect that the amphibious landing, once this thing gets into full swing, will become an important part of a three-pronged strategy. A major incursion from the west, sweeping in through Iraq and heading for Kuwait. That major push coming up from the south to take the Kuwaiti-Saudi border and head straight for Kuwait City. And the final part of that three-prong pincer movement, that trident of force, will be the amphibious landing sweeping in from the northern Persian Gulf. The Royal Navy minesweepers have been busy there. For the last week we've heard briefings of them picking off mines, destroying them, divers going down, surface mines, also mines that have been down in the depths of the sea. The Royal Navy's been there, the Saudi Navy and the United States Navy as well. It's all been a case of preparation, a gradual build-up. I remember Mike Brunson reporting from the War Cabinet 2 or 3 days ago that he quoted the press spokesman at Downing Street as saying it was a seamless web of preparation that would gradually move into this final phase of the push, where it is going to be prosecuted with speed, with violence. They've used the word quite freely. They are in the business of winning this war, and that is what they're doing now. It's moved into that phase with the order having finally given, as we were saying earlier on, approximately 9 hours ago, to take effect a couple of hours back.
Alistair Stewart in Dhahran, thank you very much indeed for that. Just to remind you that the ground war against Iraq has begun. It began at 1 o'clock in the morning, our time, 8 hours after the deadline by President Bush, set by President Bush, had expired. We're going to take a short break now. Join us again in a couple of moments. Hello, welcome back. A reminder that we're interrupting our normal coverage to bring you open-ended coverage of the start of the ground war against Iraq in Kuwait. Any minute now, I'm told, President Bush, who is back at the White House, will make a statement on the war. We will bring you that as soon as we get it. First, a summary of the latest from the ground war from Anne Lucas.
Thank you, John. The ground war has begun. It's been confirmed by officials in Washington and London. A Pentagon spokesman said this is the end game. President Bush has arrived back at the White House from Camp David. He'll talk to reporters in the White House briefing room in a couple of minutes. Military sources say a broad offensive was underway, with Allied troops engaging Iraqi forces along a 125-mile front. The CBS networks say the 17,000-strong US amphibious force was in position off Kuwait. Other reports, not confirmed officially, say large numbers of Iraqi troops have already begun surrendering. Iraq has retaliated by firing a Scud missile on targets in Saudi Arabia. A senior Pentagon official says US Army General Norman Schwarzkopf, head of the American forces in the Gulf, had received the go-ahead to launch the attack at his discretion. It seems he's not wasted any time in getting the attack underway. John.
Thanks, Anne. We go straight over to Washington now, and our correspondent there, Bill Neely. Bill, the latest from you.
Well, we're waiting for President Bush, and after President Bush will come a Defense Department, a Pentagon briefing at 10:30. We don't know yet what will be in the President's statement, but he made it quite clear today that the deadline had passed, that Iraq had not complied with the terms set out in his deadline, and he had set out quite clearly before then that Iraq had to agree to these terms if a ground war was to be avoided. Norman Schwarzkopf, we heard earlier in the day, was given the green light to take whatever action he deemed necessary at whatever time he deemed necessary. It seems the President had signed an executive order even before today's deadline expired. That is, we don't have official confirmation of that, but that, from the reports we're getting of the ground war at the minute, would seem to be the case.
Yes, indeed. I'm looking here at some latest copy. President Bush apparently said in a statement, "We regret that Saddam Hussein took no action before the deadline to comply with the United Nations resolutions." Presumably he will expand on that in the statement that we're waiting for now.
Good evening. Yesterday, after conferring with my senior national security advisors and following extensive consultations with our coalition partners, Saddam Hussein was given one last chance, set forth in very explicit terms to do what he should have done more than 6 months ago: withdraw from Kuwait without condition or further delay and comply fully with the resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council. Regrettably, the noon deadline passed without the agreement of the government of Iraq to meet demands of United Nations Security Council Resolution 660, as set forth in the specific terms spelled out by the coalition to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait. To the contrary, what we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait. Once again, this was a decision made only after extensive consultations within our coalition partnership. The liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission. Tonight, as this coalition of countries seeks to do that which is right and just, I ask only that all of you stop what you are doing and say a prayer for all the coalition forces, and especially for our men and women in uniform, who this very moment are risking their lives for their country and for all of us. May God bless and protect each and every one of them, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, any reports from the board?
The President of the United States not taking questions. His brief statement over with that poignant plea to Americans and others everywhere of a mind to pray for the well-being of the Allied troops as they set out on their mission. He has authorized, said the President, General Schwarzkopf, and the others there to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqis from Kuwait, and he has every confidence, he said, that it could be swiftly and decisively done. Charles Beer.
We leave CNN there for the moment. President Bush addressing the nation there from the White House, he said the liberation of Kuwait is in its final phase. He also said that Saddam Hussein had redoubled his efforts to destroy Kuwait. And some news just in: the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations in New York, in Baghdad's first reaction to the start of the ground war, said that his country would never surrender. I'm reading this straight off the computer here. Iraq will never surrender. A lot of Americans will die also. That from the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations, the first official Iraqi reaction to the start of the ground war. Now, as I said, President Bush has just addressed the nation. Straight over to our correspondent in Washington, Bill Neely. Bill.
Well, that was a confident statement by the President. Swift and decisive were the two words that I picked out, which the Pentagon and the coalition have been saying all along would be the case. And also that support, that call for support at the end. Please stop and pray for the coalition forces. In a sense, he doesn't need to rally support. This is a president with overwhelming support in this country. 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 Americans almost support the idea of a ground war. I think over the last 2 days, you've seen a president and an administration which believes it has recaptured the moral high ground in its battle with Saddam Hussein. Here was a man who, during his peace talks with Tariq Aziz, was in Moscow talking peace, was setting fire to the oil wells in Kuwait. We heard at the Pentagon briefing earlier today that the Iraqis had stepped up summary executions of Kuwaitis on the streets of Kuwait City. I think the administration has got the moral high ground now to launch this war, and the president clearly believes it's necessary, and he's directed Norman Schwarzkopf to use all forces, including ground forces, to eject Iraq from Kuwait. That was a very confident and firm statement from the president.
Indeed, it was interesting to note how short it was. One might have expected a full explanation from him there as to why he's gone ahead with it, but really it was very brief, and he was calling on every American to stop what they're doing and pray for the Allied forces. As you say, it's as if the justification has already been taken care of.
I think he certainly explained it in full to his own country, and I think the coalition is as solid as it has ever been. There was a thought that when the peace plans were coming up that there might be some, Iraq might succeed in causing some fracturing of the coalition, but the French were there, even most of the Arab allies were 100% behind his stand to reject the Iraqi peace proposal, the Soviet peace offer, and the Iraqi acceptance of it. The coalition is solid. He's said over and over again that this is a just war, and I think in the last 2 days the Iraqis have handed him a couple more reasons for proving that this is, in his terms, is a just war. I don't think he needs to go into too much detail about why the war is necessary. I think he just needs to be confident, as he was, and say that this will be swift and decisive. That certainly is the coalition and the US plan.
Bill, any suggestion that he may have spoken yet to President Gorbachev? Because obviously the last-minute diplomatic manoeuvres by President Gorbachev to bring this to a peaceful conclusion at one time looked like succeeding. They're now obviously history, but relations between the two countries apparently not damaged.
The last call that we know of was the 28-minute call made just before the noon Washington time, 5 o'clock your time deadline. That was a conversation in which the president thanked President Gorbachev for his peace efforts. We don't know of a conversation since then. But what is clear is that the president has made extensive consultations with allies. We know he spoke today to the Turkish President Turgut Özal and to Japan's leader, and we must presume that he has spoken over the past couple of days with all the leaders of the coalition, making it firm, making it solid. This is a president who will not move before he consults fully with the coalition. That has been his hallmark throughout this crisis. He's leading from the front, but leading by consulting along his sides with his key coalition partners.
Bill, I see on copy here that a Pentagon source says the Defense Department does not plan to release many details of what is happening over the next day or two to avoid giving the Iraqis any information that could help them in selecting a possible location for a chemical weapon attack. So presumably we're not going to get firm details from your end as to exactly what is happening and where it's happening.
That was expected. We had been led to believe that there might be a 24-hour news blackout of details. I can only presume that the reporters at the front will be subject to the same restrictions, and they are clearly and very obviously there for reasons of national security.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. Now, just to bring you up to date, the ground war against Iraq has begun. It began 8 hours after the deadline passed for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. Now then, I'm joined in the studio by Sir, perhaps first of all you can give me your name.
Professor Donald Cameron Watt.
Professor Cameron Watt, you are an expert on diplomatic affairs. Why did the diplomatic efforts at the last minute fail?
Well, it was a scam. The six-point plan, the shorter Soviet plan, had two elements in it which nobody could possibly accept. The first of them was that the existing UN resolutions would have been declared null and void. That would have meant, among other things, the UN resolution which declared the Iraqi annexation of Kuwait null and void would have been removed, and then presumably would therefore have been accepted. Equally, the resolution which authorized the UN forces to apply for peace and security, that would have been rescinded. The idea the Russians had that the peace and security would have been restored if Iraq withdrew from Kuwait was obvious nonsense. You've got the fourth largest army in the world. That's not peace and security in that sort of area if you let it return to base because nothing happened.
The other thing is that point 6 of the thing was even more of a scam because it swallowed the Iraqi story. This wasn't a dispute between Iraq and the UN. This is a dispute between Iraq and President Bush and his nefarious allies. And I don't think that, again, could have been accepted for a moment. And I'm really surprised that the Russians put both those in. But we did get a clue from the Russian spokesman who said this was best can be done at the moment. Some Russians, I think, are going to be very angry. Mr. Primakov, who threatened us if we didn't accept this. But I think the Gorbachev and the Russian foreign ministry generally, will simply write this one off as something they tried and failed with. But I don't think they expected to succeed.
Also, on the most basic level, the first clause of the agreement said an unconditional withdrawal. Iraq agreed to an unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait, followed by a string of conditions.
Oh, I know. Well, unconditional to us means what it meant during the Second World War. Get out and knock your head on the floor and say you're sorry. I don't think Saddam Hussein had got that far yet.
Do you believe that President Gorbachev was in any way trying to take the initiative away from the Allies?
I think what President Gorbachev was trying to do was to persuade the Iraqis to see sense and so that he could then cash in on as being the man who brought the peace. He'd have been in line for another Nobel Peace Prize and a lot of other things probably as a result of it. But I think that's about as far as he had gone, because one thing the Russians don't have is anything very much in the way of aid to clear up the mess. And that, I think this was a bit of a throw. I think it was forced on him by some of the hardliners in Russia and the army who don't like to see Iraq dismantled. And there are a lot of exaggerated fears. You find them, I think it's one reason for Iranian activity at the moment. The idea that, listening to some of the wilder voices from around the Pentagon, that there are going to be American forces in the Gulf for the next 20 years or so. No Congress is going to pay for that.
Professor Cameron Watt, thank you very much indeed for joining us. An update now on the very latest from Anne Lucas.
President Bush has just said that the ground war had begun because Iraq had ignored the Allies' ultimatum. He said President Saddam had undertaken to destroy Kuwait and he had no option but to enter into the final phase of the war. He said he had full faith in the ability of the coalition forces and called for prayers for the troops at the front, who he said were risking their lives. The Prime Minister John Major spoke this morning about the massive ground attack to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. He said it was in order to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait and secure the full implementation of the Security Council resolution. It's believed the offensive began just a few hours after the deadline passed. Military sources say a broad offensive is underway, with Allied troops engaging Iraqi forces along a 125-mile front. A 17,000-strong US amphibious force is in position off Kuwait. Other reports, not confirmed officially, say large numbers of Iraqi troops have already begun surrendering. Iraq has retaliated by firing a Scud missile on targets in Saudi Arabia. Earlier, along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, US Marines destroyed 33 Iraqi armoured vehicles and took an estimated 280 prisoners. A military spokesman said they had detected chemical gas, probably from a leaking dump that had been targeted by Allied bombers near the border. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the Kuwaiti ambassador said his countrymen would be soon breathing the fresh air of freedom. The Iraqi ambassador said that he believed the war would be a long one. I'll have more headlines later. Back to John.
Thanks, Anne. John Major has issued a statement from Downing Street. He spoke about the massive ground attack to drive Kuwait out of Iraq. It was, he said, in order to drive the forces out of Kuwait. To drive Iraq out of Kuwait and secure the full implementation of the Security Council resolution. His statement from Downing Street was timed to coincide with the President's statement in Washington. Now we go over to Riyadh and our correspondent there, Peter Allen. Peter, what can you tell us from Riyadh?
Well, it's dawn in Riyadh, John, and the city was woken in rather spectacular style to announce almost the beginning of this land offensive. Perhaps a last Scud, one which came as usual across, it seemed, to the centre of the city, was sought out by the Patriots. There was a huge explosion. We're just getting reports in that part of the debris of that Scud fell on a school building. There are no reports as yet of injury. I have to say it was a night marked by thunderous noise of aircraft, many of them, I think, refuelling tankers, which often take off from around this part of the country. It was quite clear that something very big was afoot. I must say all the signs last night were that this offensive was going ahead, as we heard of those atrocities occurring in Kuwait, the reports of those atrocities, as we heard of the burning oil fields, as we heard indeed that bombs had fallen in Baghdad even before the expiry of the deadline announced by President Bush. It was clear that as far as he was concerned, Iraq had run out of time, I think.
It was reported from Bill Neely in Washington, Peter, that President Bush apparently signed the order for this ground war even before the deadline was reached, passed it through the chain of command to General Schwarzkopf. Therefore, as soon as the deadline passed, General Schwarzkopf was free to take the military decision off on his own initiative. Is that what military sources there are confirming?
We're not getting a lot of information this morning from military sources, but I think it was quite clear that they were all set to go. Indeed, I must say in retrospect, when you look at the way that this particular conflict has been organised, and as I speak, another of those planes thundering over above me, so I apologise if my voice is for a second drowned out. I must say it's seen throughout this conflict that there has been a very steady progression in the way that the Allies have built up this conflict. First of all, we had the air assault, then we had the navies joining in, then we had the combined air and land assault, then we had the land, increasingly the tanks getting involved, increasingly the incursions through that sand wall, the berm which is built along the border, and it all seemed a very inexorable process that and this its logical outcome. The Allies have not actually flinched and not changed direction much. It's the Iraqis have to some extent lashed around, sometimes talking of peace, sometimes talking of war. The Allies for their part have been fairly steadfast so far.
Peter, obviously we can't expect minute-by-minute updates from the military sources there as to what's going on for fear that the Iraqis pick up the information. But what sort of information do you expect now to be given there in Riyadh?
Well, what we're hoping is that we're going to get regular briefings from those military sources whom I've been quoting so often in the past weeks. What we're hoping is that we're going to get updates. But this is a very difficult business, really. Clearly, there's nothing that they will say which will in any way jeopardise the lives of the men who are at present risking their lives on the front. We've heard all sorts of reports, and reports of amphibious assaults, reports of tanks going in various places in the border, some people talking about tanks going into Iraq. I could speculate about all of them. Frankly, it would not be of enormous value to you because it is mostly speculation. We're getting a lot of gossip around here at the moment. And what I would say is that if I really knew some hard information, then you and I would both share a common cause. We wouldn't pass it on if it was going to do any good to the Iraqis. So I think, unfortunately, you're not going to get a lot of hard information in this first 24 hours. I think mostly people will be talking in generalities. They will report on incidents when they are over and done with. We will not get reports of incidents which are occurring. And I imagine the same applies to those representatives of ITN and other reporters who are, of course, on the front line with those troops as they go across the border.
Peter, thanks very much indeed. From what we do know, the ground war against Iraq to liberate Kuwait began 2¼ hours ago, just 8 hours after the expiry of the deadline set by President Bush. And a reminder of the first official reaction from Iraq. It came from Iraq's ambassador to the United Nations in New York. He said Iraq will never surrender. A lot of Americans will die also. The first official reaction from Iraq to the start of the ground war against Iraq, what an American source has already called the end game. Now, a reminder, we're interrupting our normal programmes on ITV to bring you the latest developments on the Gulf War. We'll stay on the air as the news from the Gulf comes in. For the moment, we'll take a short break. Join us again in a few moments. Welcome back. Let me bring you up to date. The ground war against Iraq has begun. It began at 1 o'clock in the morning, our time. Some latest information. President Bush has said the liberation of Kuwait has now entered a final phase. He said, I have complete confidence in the ability of the coalition forces swiftly and decisively to accomplish their mission. And as we reported just before the break, Iraq's first official reaction has come from its United Nations ambassador, who said Iraq will never surrender. We're going straight to the Pentagon, where Dick Cheney, the Defense Secretary, is about to give a live briefing.
amphibious landings, any airborne landings designed to go into Kuwait City, liberate Kuwait City. Certainly those are the big questions right now, and hopefully within the next few moments we'll be able to get some of the answers. The Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, of course, being very much involved in all of these preparations. The President of the United States made his statement. Now Pete Williams, the Pentagon spokesman, is approaching the podium. Let's listen.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The Secretary has just come back from the White House, where he listened along with everyone else to the President's statement. As a short statement, take a very few questions, and then he'll have to go. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Pete. Just a short time ago, you heard the President announce that coalition forces of Operation Desert Storm have begun a large-scale ground operation against Iraqi forces inside Kuwait. This phase of the combined air, land, and sea campaign has been carefully planned to force Iraq out of Kuwait with a minimum number of casualties to Allied forces. Up to now, we've been as forthcoming as possible about military operations. But from this point forward, we must limit what we say. We've now undertaken a major military operation. Allied military units are on the move. Their positions, movements, and plans must be carefully safeguarded. We must assume that the enemy is confused about what is happening on the battlefield, and it is absolutely essential that we not do anything inadvertently ourselves to clarify the picture for him. Everything we say about the operation from this point forward, every detail we offer, would increase the likelihood that the military forces of Iraq could learn more about our operations. Such information would put military operations at risk, and even the most innocent-sounding information could be used directly against the men and women whose lives are on the line carrying out these operations. We cannot permit the Iraqi forces to know anything about what we're doing. And for that reason, I will not say anything tonight about the operation that is currently underway. We will have nothing to say about it for many more hours. When it is safe to begin discussing the operation, we will do so in as much detail as we prudently can. But for now, our regular briefing schedule here at the Pentagon and in Riyadh is suspended until further notice. I want to assure all of you that we understand our solemn obligation to the American people to keep them informed of developments. But I am confident that they understand that this policy is necessary to save lives and to reduce American casualties, as well as those of coalition forces. I will be happy to take a few questions about the background to the decision that's been made, but let me reemphasize once again, I will not answer any questions about the military operation underway. And at the end of my remarks, we will then, as I indicated previously, suspend all further briefings for the time being. Yes, sir.
When did the President make the decision to go ahead with the ground war and to give Schwarzkopf the authority?
Final decision, of course, to go forward wasn't really resolved until it was clear today that the deadline had come and gone and Saddam Hussein had refused to comply with the UN resolutions. But this has obviously been a massive undertaking with hundreds of thousands of people involved, enormous logistical planning, a great deal of preparation required to undertake this kind of operation. So for some period of time now, we've had a planning date and a planning hour that was selected by General Schwarzkopf based upon when he believed his forces would be ready, based upon when he felt we would have accomplished all we could with the air phase of the campaign by itself, based upon preparations of coalition forces, and that became a planning date. It was subject to change up to the last minute based upon such considerations as weather and changes in the diplomatic situation. If Saddam Hussein had come into compliance with the deadline, had announced by noon today that he was prepared to withdraw unconditionally his forces from Kuwait, then we would have stopped the preparations for an execution of the operation. So in that sense, up until noon today, the President had the option to say, stop. He had approved the original date, again, based upon the planning considerations that I indicated.
Was the original date today?
That's correct. To the extent that we had a specific planning date in mind for some period of time now. It was this particular day and a particular hour.
How long had you been planning?
But because there are different units involved going at different times, I don't want to be any more precise than I've already been. David?
You mentioned that this was a large-scale ground operation against Iraqi forces inside Kuwait. By that, did you mean to say that the ground operation will take place only inside Kuwait?
David, I simply am not going to talk about the operation. I am not in a position to be able to say anything about the operation without compromising the security of the operation, and I simply am going to refuse to accept all such questions.
Mr. Secretary, do you know yet to the extent that the Iraqi forces are resisting?
I do not have any detailed reporting at this point on the operation. It's still very early, the early stages of the operation, and I would not expect that we will receive any comprehensive reporting here in the Pentagon for some period of time.
Mr. Secretary, you had repeatedly said that the ground operation would not begin until you were confident that the air campaign had gotten to a point where much of the risk had been eliminated for the ground troops. Can you share with us what the progress of the last 8 days has been and why you are now confident that there is a minimal risk, or however you want to characterize it, for our ground troops?
Well, I would not say that there is minimal risk. This is a major military operation against a well-equipped, well-fortified opponent. I would not want to underestimate the difficulties of the task at all. What we have said repeatedly was that we wanted to conduct an air campaign for as long as possible to destroy as much as possible of the Iraqi force and to make it easier for us to undertake the ground phase of the operation when that became possible. We obviously have reached that point where we think it's appropriate to kick in the next phase of the campaign.
Mr. Secretary, the President said he has consulted with all the Allied coalition members. Can you give us a rough percentage of how many coalition members actually have committed ground forces and have actually are on the move?
I don't want to do that tonight. That again gets us into the business of talking about specific forces, specific units, and what they might be doing in connection with the operation. A significant number of our allies are, in fact, participating in this phase of the campaign.
Can you tell us about the process of consulting with them, or at least informing them before we went ahead with the ground initiative? Can you give us a little bit of a sense of the reaction as you told them we're going in?
There's really been work at two levels. There's been work at the military level between General Schwarzkopf and the other commanders in the field in terms of planning the details of the operation and preparing the forces to carry them out. There's also been extensive consultation by the President and Secretary Baker with the political leadership of those nations involved.
Secretary, Mr. Secretary, the goal of this operation was to free Kuwait, and the Soviets up to this last moment had an agreement by the Iraqis to pull out of Kuwait. What was the sense of urgency to move now to extract Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in light of that agreement?
Well, it's been stated repeatedly, but I'll state it again, that the only acceptable solution to this conflict is for complete compliance by the Iraqis with the UN Security Council resolutions. That includes the immediate, unconditional withdrawal of their forces from Kuwait. As made clear by the President yesterday, we wanted an indication from them that they would begin that withdrawal by noon today, and we gave them 7 days in which to complete it. They refused to do that. It included as well consideration for the fact that the offer you talk about, the proposition that the Soviets and the Iraqis developed, involved a ceasefire prior to any Iraqi withdrawal. We made it clear repeatedly we were not interested in any ceasefires, that a ceasefire would simply have allowed Saddam Hussein to regroup his forces, resupply them, and could conceivably have cost even more casualties. It's also true that that proposition embodied within it the repeal of all the other UN sanctions and resolutions that have been voted by the Security Council. We felt that was totally unacceptable. We've seen just in the last 72 hours what would appear to be a deliberate effort on the part of the Iraqis to further destroy what's left of Kuwait, to put the torch to the oil fields, reports of executions of Kuwaiti citizens inside Kuwait City. And under the circumstances, the notion that Saddam Hussein should be permitted to get away scot-free without being held accountable for his actions or without having to pay reparations, for example, was unacceptable from the standpoint of the coalition. The president's statement yesterday was very clear, it was very concise in terms of what we wanted from Saddam Hussein by way of compliance with these resolutions. It was agreed upon by the coalition. It was consistent with the UN Security Council resolutions. He would have been wise to accept it. He refused to do so.
Mr. Secretary, again, can you put yourself in the position of disavowing any effort to change the government, the leadership, the political structure of Iraq by means of fully enforcing the UN resolutions? Suppose you knock him out of Kuwait and he says, I'm still not going to pay reparations. Do you then go on to Baghdad to set up a government that will pay the reparations?
We've made it clear repeatedly that if Saddam Hussein were to be replaced by another government, we would not shed a tear over his demise. But we've also made it clear that it is not an objective of U.S. policy to change the government of Iraq. If that happens, so be it. With respect to the future application of the sanctions that have already been voted by the UN Security Council, how they would be applied or altered with respect to this government of Iraq or some future government of Iraq is really a matter that the UN Security Council will have to address in due course once they're driven out of Kuwait. I'll do one more question.
Any sort of communication whatsoever today from Saddam Hussein in any form?
None that I'm aware of.
Mr. Secretary.
Again, let me, by way of closing, emphasize what I mentioned at the outset, that we recognize we have an obligation to provide as much information as we possibly can to the press and to the American people. But we are currently engaged in an extremely complex military undertaking. The lives of literally thousands of Americans and Allied personnel are at stake, and we simply have to operate on the basis that we are going to, for the time being, put a lid on further briefings about the operation. As soon as it's possible to do so, General Schwarzkopf in Riyadh, General Powell here at the Pentagon, we'll be happy to provide as much detail as possible about the campaign itself. But that's going to have to await developments. Thank you very much.
What time did it start?
The American Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, live there at the Pentagon in Washington. Let me remind you briefly of what he said. He warned us all that up till now, the Pentagon had been forthcoming about telling us what had been going on in the air campaign, both in Washington and with their official briefing officers in Riyadh. That would now end, he said. We must assume that the enemy is confused about what is happening. And obviously, he said, we don't want to say anything at our briefings that would give the Iraqis any information. However, he did say that we do not want to underestimate Iraqi forces. He also said that it is not an objective of US policy to change the government of Iraq. If it happens, though, he said, so be it. Now, one point that he did make very early on was that a planning date and hour for the land campaign to start had been decided on in consultation with General Schwarzkopf some time ago. I'm going to take that point up now with our correspondent in Washington, Bill Neely. Bill, it's the first we've heard that the date had been arranged quite a long time ago, which in fact the British commander in the field, General Sir Peter de la Billiere, had said some time ago.
Yes, he did, and in fact this operation has now taken place in one of the windows of opportunity that there had been a great deal of speculation about. And we'd heard, indeed, within the last 36 hours that the weather was good for a military operation of this kind. And interestingly, during that briefing, Dick Cheney hinted at what he'd said, I think 3 weeks ago for the first time, that there comes a point when there is a law of diminishing returns, when air power ceases to have the effectiveness that it should have, really, there are only so many targets that you can actually pick out. There is only so many sorties that you can fly to try to clear the path for ground troops. And then you begin to reach the point of diminishing returns, where you've got planes coming back, perhaps coming back with missiles, or planes that are going over targets and not finding anything new to hit. And I think a coincidence, the bringing together of those two things. He also mentioned that the plan was subject to change, a change in the weather or a change in the diplomatic climate. I think what I said earlier still holds, that the President probably, although we've no proof of this, probably informed his commander, General Schwarzkopf in Saudi Arabia, that if the Iraqis did not comply by midday Eastern Standard Time, Washington time, at 5 o'clock in the evening your time, then the plans that have already been arranged, the military packages that have been discussed and planned since the middle of August, that they should go ahead.
Bill, in Washington, thanks very much indeed. I'm going to bring in my guest in the studio with me here in London, Paddy Ashdown, leader of the Liberal Democrats. Mr. Ashdown.
Good morning, John.
What do you make of this?
Well, it's happened, I think, when most of us thought it would. It's happened in the military window, and that window was chosen. I agree very much with Bill. There will have been a number of dates, times chosen, largely, I suspect, determined by the weather and the tides. What we will now see is a battle which will be fought and which will have to be fought in our terms, not his, and the whole of the name of the game will be to fight a manoeuvre battle, a fast battle. I'm fascinated by the fact that they have clearly gone in at dawn. I think that says quite a deal about the confidence that they have in the initial breaking through phase of this. If they had had less confidence, they would have gone in at night. But it's clear that having gone in at dawn, they want to make very fast progress in the daylight hours and continue through in the night. I think what we'll see is a build-up of momentum to be carried forward into a fast war. Saddam Hussein will want to bog us down into a war of fixed positions, a war of attrition, and that we must not allow ourselves to fight. We want to use the deserts, and we want to stay away from the built-up areas and do what we can to cut off his forces.
You're speaking there as a military man, a former military man, rather than a politician. And indeed, it does seem to be coming through from the statements that we're hearing that the war has now moved from the politicians. It is now in the military commander's hands. Do you believe that General Schwarzkopf now has a totally free hand to conduct this campaign as he wishes?
Yes, within the terms set by the UN resolutions, and that's how it should be. We failed. The politicians have failed to keep the peace. We now have to hand it over to the soldiers, and we have to have the ability and trust in their skill and to Providence to produce a quick victory with the minimum casualties. It really is not up to politicians at this stage to interfere from several thousand miles away in the conduct of the war, provided it stays within the ambits, within the constraints that have been set by the UN resolutions.
We obviously don't want to discuss tactics in too great a detail for the very same reason that Dick Cheney has said, that we don't want to give any information away. However, you as a former soldier, do you see this as being a lightning campaign? Will it be quickly over, or should we expect now several weeks of warfare?
Well, John, you can't tell, and I don't want to speculate, frankly, but I will only say this, that it must be our aim to fight a fast war. There's an old military saying, the first casualty in war is the plan. What I'm clear is that this has been a very carefully laid out plan. If it is a war of manoeuvre, and I'm sure it must be, we'll want to use all our superiority, that is air superiority, sea superiority, and manoeuvrability on land. And the key to it all will have been logistics. And that's why I suspect we spent so long building those up. Beyond that, we must be going for a fast war. How long that will be, what mistakes there'll be, as there always are, huge operation. I don't know. What I will say is this, that we in Britain, the best thing we can do to support our services now is to show the same courage and determination to drive this through, perhaps even in the face of bad news when it comes, to give them the chance to be able to do what has to be done.
Paddy Ashdown, thank you very much indeed. Let's return to Washington and our correspondent, Bill Neely. Bill, I suppose it is a fact, as Paddy Ashdown said, it will be a war of manoeuvre. The Allies can manoeuvre, but in fact the Iraqis are bunkered down, so in a sense they're static, and that will be a feature presumably of this war.
That's right, and that would be a feature of the planning as well. The Iraqi fortifications are reasonably well known to the Pentagon, both through satellite information, satellite photography, and the reconnaissance exercises that have been carrying out deeper and deeper into occupied Kuwait over the past few days. And one thing I'd just like to pick up that Paddy Ashdown mentioned, and I think it's recognised here, President Bush, I think, has handed control of this operation now over to Norman Schwarzkopf. This is not a president who, he's said many, many times, this will not be another Vietnam. And he means that in many ways. He means it politically, that the troops will not have their hands tied behind their back by politicians. But more interestingly, he also means that it will not be like President Johnson, who boasted that there was not a target in Vietnam that was hit without him knowing about it, that he chose the targets from the Oval Office and directed the bombers and directed the fire to Vietnam. This is a president who has complete confidence in General Schwarzkopf, who has now handed over responsibility for the military campaign to him, and it's up to General Schwarzkopf now to carry out the very carefully planned campaign that has been talked about and planned between Dick Cheney, General Schwarzkopf, Colin Powell and the President for months now.
Bill Neely in Washington, thanks very much indeed. As we reported earlier, we have had some official reaction from the Iraqi ambassador at the United Nations. We have this report on both Iraqi and Kuwaiti reaction at the UN in New York.
We have just gotten our first reaction from the Iraqi deputy ambassador to the UN to the start of the ground war. The ambassador was just leaving the UN to go to his mission to learn about more details, apparently to watch television probably, to get more details about the beginning of the land battle. On his way to his car, the Iraqi ambassador said Iraq will never surrender. A reporter raised the possibility that thousands or even tens of thousands of Iraqis might die if there's no surrender, and he said, but a lot of Americans will die also. And as he got into his car, here was what he had to say.
What you've heard, though, how do you feel about the ground war beginning?
I think it will be a long war.
But the Kuwaiti ambassador to the UN spoke with great eloquence. Here is some of what he had to say.
Emotion of relief for the, my people in Kuwait. The country which has been under brutal occupation since the 2nd of August, that at least, they will be smelling, the fresh air of freedom, and they will get rid of this dictator and his army, which has inflicted in my country untold misery, and he disturbed the security in the region and in the world at large. My agony is that while we were striving since the 2nd of August to bring a peaceful solution for this conflict, for only the sake of one intransigent leader, the world is paying dearly in order to preserve peace and security. We are sorry that we were not able to convince, the whole world was not able to convince Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait and to save his nation, his country, and the region, the catastrophe which he has brought.
The UN Security Council is still scheduled to meet tonight. They are supposed to be talking about merging the Soviet and the U.S. Peace plans, but at this point, at this moment, the diplomatic mergers seem moot. I'm Jeannie Mose reporting live from the UN.
That report from America's cable news network. Now for an update on the latest news, over to Ann Lucas.
Dick Cheney, the US Defense Secretary, said the war could only be stopped by Iraq's full compliance with the United Nations resolutions as demanded by the Allies. He said the final phase of the war has been the result of a huge logistical undertaking. Mr. Cheney announced that everything that is said about the land offensive would be useful information to the Iraqis, and military briefings were now to be cancelled. In answer to reporters' questions, he said the final decision to go forward was not taken until after the deadline had passed. Mr. Cheney would not say whether the battle would be restricted to Kuwait or whether troops would enter Iraq, but he said US policy is not directed at changing the Iraqi government. Earlier, President Bush said the ground war had begun because Iraq had ignored the Allies' ultimatum. He said President Saddam had undertaken to destroy Kuwait and he had no option but to enter into the final phase of the war. He said he had full faith in the ability of the coalition forces and called for prayers for the troops at the front, who he said were risking their lives. The Prime Minister John Major this morning said, "Our thoughts will be with the Allied forces and with their families. We admire their courage, we wish them success, and we pray God that they will return home safe." Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the Kuwaiti ambassador said his countrymen would soon be breathing the fresh air of freedom. The Iraqi ambassador there said he believed the war would be a long one. He said Iraq will never surrender and a lot of Americans will die. Baghdad Radio has not yet reported that the offensive has started. Military sources say a broad offensive is underway, with Allied troops engaging Iraqi forces along a 125-mile front. A 17,000-strong US amphibious force is in position off Kuwait. Other reports, not confirmed officially, say large numbers of Iraqi troops have already begun surrendering. Iraq has retaliated by firing a Scud missile on targets in Saudi Arabia. Earlier, along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, US Marines destroyed 33 Iraqi armoured vehicles and took an estimated 280 prisoners. A military spokesman said they had detected chemical gas, probably from a leaking dump that had been targeted by Allied bombers near the border. I'll have more news later. Now back to John.
There are 40,000 British troops in the Gulf. A lot of families are waiting for news from the Gulf area as the land war progresses. Our reporter, David Chater, is with the Gulf Support Group in Glasgow.
In hundreds of homes throughout Glasgow tonight, candles are being lit for the men in the front line as the ground assault goes in. The fears for their loved ones now all too real. It's at this time, above all, that self-help groups like this one are needed. Somewhere to share their emotions, to lean on others in the anxious hours and days that lie ahead as the ground battle unfolds.
You know, I know that he's one of the first in. And you read so much about what's going to happen, you know, and you just wonder how they're going to come home. Are they going to come home the same boys as they went out?
There's no word that can explain exactly what goes through your mind, because you sort of sit and you think about all the things that could happen, and then you try to say, but it won't happen. But the wee voice says, but it might. And I suppose at this time you've really got to, it's only God that can help you, and you've really got to say, right, well, God will be done.
The support group has been collecting items to send out to the troops in the Gulf. Small things like crisp packets or sweets, anything to remind them of home, to bring them some small comfort in the desert, items that many of the soldiers will now be carrying with them into battle.
Small, simple things like Jaffa cakes, particular types of sweets, which remind them of home.
Volunteers are manning the phones here 24 hours a day, taking calls from soldiers' families and relatives, giving what help they can. Annie Weisner knows what they're going through. She lost a son in the Falklands.
It's a pure hell. It is a pure hell. You take each day as it comes. But I found that the group helped me, because I could come in here and I could talk about Mark, where some people, which I call the outside world, find it very bit embarrassing.
As the candles burn in thousands of windows throughout Scotland, all thoughts are now with the soldiers in the Gulf as battle is joined on the ground. David Chater, ITN, in Glasgow.
British families waiting for news from the area. I'm joined in the studio now by Talal Al-Salem of the Free Kuwait campaign. When was the last time you were able to talk to your sources in Kuwait?
Well, the last time was about a day ago, when in fact we had a lot of reports about lots of arrests and murder taking place in the streets, so that it got to the point where the young Kuwaitis between the ages of, from 14 and upwards, were actually getting arrested and either interned in Iraq, possibly for the use later maybe as a bargaining chip or the last card for whatever. And others who actually got murdered on the spot if they resisted.
We heard President Bush in his statement yesterday when he set the deadline, saying that there were reports coming in of summary executions, and indeed it's now believed that the Iraqis are putting Kuwait to the torch.
This is what seems like. Saddam seems to be carrying on every single evil promise he promised and ducking every single peaceful promise he promised, which seems to be in character with this man. And although the ground war, having started, might have devastating effect on Kuwait, however, we feel it is an important thing to get rid of evil in the area and get rid of Saddam and stop his military power from spreading any further. And we hope that this is going to be a fast and surgical war with the minimum losses to the Allies' forces. We feel with the British people at home waiting for their loved ones in the Gulf. I, as one, have all my family still in Kuwait, and I haven't heard from them since the 2nd of August.
You're not able to get through in any way to them?
Not at all. Not since the 2nd of August. I haven't been able to hear anything from them. And this is very, very torturous. The only thing we have is general reports of summary executions and murder and rape taking place inside Kuwait. And I do feel for the families at this particular moment, and we hope and we pray that this is going to be as quick as possibly can.
Mr. Al-Salam, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We'll bring you up to date in a moment, but just to remind you, we're interrupting our normal programmes on ITV to bring you the latest developments on the Gulf War. We'll stay on the air as the news from the Gulf comes in. For the moment, we'll take a short break. Join us in a few minutes. Welcome back. A reminder that we're staying on the air to bring you up to date with developments in the Gulf War. The land war has started. It started approximately 3 hours ago. Dick Cheney has said, "We do not want to underestimate the Iraqi forces. It is not an objective of US policy to change the government of Iraq," he said. "If it happens, so be it." That was the American Defense Secretary. I'm joined now from Dhahran by Alistair Stewart. Alistair, do you have any new information for us?
Yes, talking to various people, and also, most importantly, John, some reports are now beginning to come back from the front from various reporters who went up there several days ago to be in position for just this eventuality. And what they're confirming is that this is a multi-pronged offensive, theatre-wide fighting, not limited to just inside Kuwait. One report that's coming from just south of the Kuwaiti border, we think probably near the town of Hafji, says the bombardment is very heavy, it's still going on. We understand there that the troops are mainly Saudi and Qatari. It's always been understood that they will be the ones given the job of taking Kuwait City in the end. One source here is saying that the objective is to take Kuwait City within 36 hours. There was mention made earlier on about the air forces being in surge mode. Pilots were reporting several days ago about the dangers of that. They're going to have to be going in wave after wave, attacking targets to take tanks out as they go. And one final point, the amphibious assault that was talked about earlier on. We understand that the island of Felaka has indeed been taken, and that's not only a success, if you like, but an important staging post.
That it, in fact, controls the waterways into Kuwait, I understand, which makes the possibility of an amphibious landing all the more likely.
I think that's absolutely right. And the other thing that's been talked about here over the last few days is that the amphibious force, given the sheer scale of it, could not only be targeting Kuwait, but also could have its eyes heading up toward the north and to the vital centre of Basra, because General Schwarzkopf has made clear he not only wants to retake Kuwait, but he wants to cut it off from the Republican Guard, who is still established in that southern Iraqi area. And if he came in from the east toward Basra and headed south, and from the west with the main tank force, which we know is where that main thrust is coming, that would be the perfect pincer movement. Basra is vital to that plan.
We've heard from Dick Cheney in Washington that we will not be receiving regular briefings, Alistair, so we have to speculate ourselves without obviously giving away anything strategically important. But is there any indication to you that anything other than a full-scale offensive has been launched? In other words, there has been talk of a single-punch strategy through the middle with flanking, but it does seem to me that it is an all-out offensive.
That is clearly our understanding. One point I should stress on the point about Dick Cheney saying that the official briefings have been suspended. That was to be expected, but a number of correspondents have gone into the field quite independently of the pooling system, and that is going to be a very important source of information. I don't think anybody is going to break the rules because nobody is clearly going to be wanting to jeopardize this operation, but we will have some information hopefully coming from that source. But the answer to your central question is yes, a full-scale assault, but the Pentagon made it clear earlier on today of the 500,000 coalition troops that are here in the theatre of operations, probably 250,000 are going to be involved in the first phase. That's an enormous reserve of 250,000 also still there, but 250,000, that's all out.
Yes, so we're clearly talking, again, Dick Cheney warned we must not underestimate the Iraqi forces. As when the air war started, they seem to be saying to us, don't expect a quick result.
No, I think that is clear that, as the Pentagon have made perfectly clear in all of their briefings up to now, this is a very precise plan that has been emerging over 38 days already. The air campaign has now moved into this ground offensive. It will not be short and sharp, except, as I said earlier on, we did have that one source saying that the ambition was to regain Kuwait City within 36 hours. I've just been handed a note from one of our other people here who says that we've just heard from another of those correspondents at the front that the ground just south of the border is literally shaking with the bombardment. At one point, on the strength of the Iraqi forces, a commander was quoted as saying the other day about the Iraqi artillery, he said it's very good, they have a lot of it and they have a lot of ammunition in reserve. But what the Allies have got is return fire radar. The moment that our Iraqi artillery opens up, they can literally trace the shell line back to where it came from, and he said within 5 minutes we'll be hitting it on the head. The threat is there, but the Allies have worked out in precise detail and they have the precise equipment to deal with that threat.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed for that. We'll have the latest now from the studio, and Anne Lucas.
Sources say Allied troops are engaging Iraqi forces along a 125-mile front. A 17,000-strong US amphibious force is reported off the coast of Kuwait. Earlier, along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border, US Marines destroyed 33 Iraqi armoured vehicles and took an estimated 280 prisoners. A military spokesman said they had detected chemical gas, probably from a leaking dump that had been targeted by Allied bombers near the border. The US 18th Airborne Corps was said to have gone into Kuwait, firing Hellfire missiles from Apache helicopters. The 20,000-strong 2nd US Marine Division was said to have made an incursion into Iraq. The Kuwaiti news agency reported that Allied forces had captured the small island of Falaka, which commands the sea approaches to Kuwait City. Huge surrenders by Iraqi soldiers, mainly conscripts, were reported as Allied ground forces pushed 12 to 16 miles inside the Kuwaiti border. Iraq has retaliated by firing a Scud missile on targets in Saudi Arabia. In Washington, Dick Cheney, the US Defense Secretary, said the war could only be stopped by Iraq's full compliance with the United Nations resolutions as demanded by the Allies. Mr. Cheney announced that everything that is said about the land offensive would be useful information to the Iraqis, and military briefings were now to be cancelled. Earlier, President Bush said the ground war had begun because Iraq had ignored the Allies' ultimatum. He said President Saddam had undertaken to destroy Kuwait and he had no option but to enter into the final phase of the war. He said he had full faith in the ability of the coalition forces and called for prayers for the troops at the front, who he said were risking their lives. The Prime Minister John Major this morning said, "Our thoughts will be with the Allied forces and with their families. We admire their courage, we wish them success, and we pray God that they will return home safe." The Labour leader, Mr Neil Kinnock, has said we must hope the war is over as quickly as possible with the minimum loss of life. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the Kuwaiti ambassador said his countrymen would be soon breathing the fresh air of freedom. The Iraqi ambassador said that he believed the war would be a long one. He said Iraq will never surrender and a lot of Americans will die. Baghdad Radio has not yet reported that the offensive has started. I'll have more news later. Now back to John.
Thank you. We have just managed to get through to another of our correspondents in the area, Mark Austin in Bahrain. Mark?
Yes, hello, John. Well, with day breaking here, it's expected the RAF's role in the ground war will begin with Jaguar ground attack planes presumably bombing troops, artillery and tank positions in southern Kuwait. It's the job they've been doing for 5 weeks already, of course, but it now becomes crucial support for the Allied troops on the offensive in Kuwait. RAF Tornadoes are also likely to carry on their bombing raids against airfields in Iraq and against enemy supply routes to prevent ammunition, spare parts, food and water from reaching the front. Of course, for the RAF, it'll be the first test of how successful their air campaign has been over recent weeks. Just to what extent have the Allied airstrikes been effective in softening up Iraqi troops to enable the offensive to proceed more smoothly? If anything, it's expected that Allied air missions will become more intense now that the ground war, the final phase, as they call it, has begun.
Mark, what is the mood among airmen there now that they are, as it were, not alone in prosecuting this war?
Well, I haven't spoken to the airmen this morning, but certainly last night there was an anticipation that this thing would now be over soon once the ground war started, and I think it's something that they've been waiting for, as I say, just so that it'll become clear how successful the RAF have been in prosecuting their part of the war. I've seen already Jaguar planes leave this morning, though obviously I can't say where they're going or what they're tasked against specifically. But I think the mood will be, it looks as though the final phase has begun and things will be over soon, let's hope.
Mark Austin in Bahrain, thank you very much indeed. As we reported earlier, President Bush has returned from his retreat at Camp David in Maryland to the White House in Washington. We have this report from the American network CNN.
Yesterday, after conferring with my senior national security advisors and following extensive consultations with our coalition partners, Saddam Hussein was given one last chance, set forth in very explicit terms to do what he should have done more than 6 months ago: withdraw from Kuwait without condition or further delay and comply fully with the resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council. Regrettably, the noon deadline passed without the agreement of the government of Iraq to meet demands of United Nations Security Council Resolution 660, as set forth in the specific